Saluton al ciui. Hello, everybody. My name is Firooznia. I'm one of the directors of Esperanto-USA, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight. Dr. Brigid O'Keeffe is a historian who studies Russia, both in the late Tsarist period, if I understand it properly, as well as the Soviet era. She teaches at Brooklyn College at the City University of New York, or among her many writings, I should say, are a few about that touch upon Esperanto. The one that I first came across was an introduction to the book Anta un Jarcento, which is about the First World War, Esperantists in the First World War, which was published just a couple of years ago by SAT. It's a collection of essays to which Dr. O'Keeffe wrote the introduction. It was also in Belletra al Monaco in 2018. You may have seen it there. Most recently, she's written a book directly related to Esperanto and its history in the early Soviet era, which she will talk about. I want to quickly mention that there is a review that we just published of that as well in the last issue of Uson Esperantisto by Brandon Sowers, who's here with us. I encourage you to go take a look at it. The way this will go is we'll do about 30 minutes of presentation, during which I ask you to all mute yourself, please, and then we'll do a Q&A session after that. So, Dr. O'Keeffe, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here this evening. I first want to thank Brandon and Haas for making this happen and coming up with the idea of me giving this brief presentation this evening. But I did want to give a special shout out to Brandon because not only is he the first reviewer of my book, but it was a particularly gratifying review because when I read it, I thought, oh, he knew exactly what I was trying to do. But I also wanted to call your attention to it for another reason, which is that Brandon highlighted from the start of the review something that I also wanted to highlight from the start of my remarks this evening, which is that I came at this topic in the first place as a historian of modern Russia and the Soviet Union, and not as an Esperantist. And so while I did learn, to read some Esperanto, I've never been brave enough to have a conversation in it, and I'm certainly not brave enough to even attempt speaking Esperanto tonight. So I offer my apologies on that score, and I thank you for your patience. I wanted to say, just by way of prefacing my comments also, that if you were to look briefly at kind of my record as a historian and the types of topics and projects that I have been attracted to over the years, I've kind of demonstrated very proudly a commitment to studying people and topics whom other historians and the wider public tend to kind of dismiss as presumably kind of marginal to the kind of big moments or big topics or big movements in history. And I do this because as a social historian, I firmly believe, that it is oftentimes the people who end up being kind of blithely dismissed as kind of marginal or a sideshow to the kind of main action of history are actually more often than not, they tend to be kind of exemplary of something important in history and that they're worth studying in and of their own right. So in a previous book that has nothing to do with Esperanto, I had written about Roma in the early Soviet Union. I've also been spending some time writing about an extraordinary woman named Ivy Litvinov, who actually did not get along very well with the Soviet Esperantists, but who was pretty much dismissed by contemporaries and historians since as just a commissar's wife. I say this because one of the great joys for me in writing this book is that I think that, my hunch, played out really remarkably in this case. Having finished the book, which is officially being published in hard copy tomorrow, I am kind of convinced of the merits of my approach that the Esperantists can and do tell us something important about modern European history, modern global history, some important things about Russian and Soviet history that have gone kind of under-examined or underappreciated, not only by experts, but also by the wider public. And that certainly my hope is that I have contributed in some small way to maybe pushing some of my colleagues and my comrades in the fields of professional history to kind of paying some more concerted attention to Esperantists and the struggles they engaged in and the debates they engaged in, and to bringing some of that attention out from the footnotes and into the kind of main narratives of history. So with that as my preface, I do have some slides that I'm going to use throughout the talk, but they're primarily decorative. So this is the cover of the book, which comes out with Bloomsbury officially tomorrow. And you'll notice, I think that probably all of you will notice outright that the poster that adorns the cover of this book features 4 languages here, and none of them are Esperanto. This was an early Soviet poster for an institution called the Commentary Comintern or the Communist International, which I'll say a few words about in a moment. But this was done by choice. It has something to do with some of the things that I argue in the book. But I will give you a preview on the next slide of what the table of contents look like before I give you a kind of mini preview, maybe some kind of highlights of the different chapters within. The first chapter covers a story that I have absolute faith that those of you who are in the room with us today know a great deal about, right? And here is my attempt to kind of look at the birth of Esperanto and to understand the life and the personality and the mission and the vision of Zamenhof himself. And I tried to very purposefully give my own spin on it while also building from people who have gone before me. And the spin that I offer is kind of twofold. There were two things that I wanted to emphasize that I found lacking in some of the other treatments. One is I wanted to place Zamenhof more expressly in his context as a kind of exemplary figure, an exemplary subject of the Tsarist Empire, a Jewish subject of the Tsarist Empire, very importantly, but also a subject of the Tsarist Empire that was, at the time that Zamenhof was coming of age, at the time in which he offered up Esperanto to the world, was kind of trembling and shaking with kind of these momentous socioeconomic, political, and cultural changes, right? All underneath the roof of a kind of very heavy-handed and very stubborn autocracy. Now, the stubborn Tsarist autocracy is also no surprise to anyone in the room, right? But if you're not, someone who lives and breathes Russian history as I do, it may not be readily apparent that the Tsarist autocracy, as stubborn and kind of iron-fisted as it was during these years, in many ways, via its stubbornness, its refusal to kind of give vent to ordinary people and intelligentsia figures alike, was creating the conditions through which, right, an extraordinary era of kind of cultural and intellectual and philosophical ferment happened, right? And so I try to look at Esperanto as a movement and a vision that is rooted in this fertile soil of this Tsarist empire in crisis, and that should be understood alongside and potentially in conversation with some of the other isms that we associate as kind of like utopian programs that the Russian intelligentsia embraced during these years, in which they, in very aching fashion, kind of sought to generate and imagine new futures for Russia and the world. The other thing that I wanted to give more kind of contextual weight to is that this was a period for Zamenhof, but also for the kind of wider context in which he lived in Russia, in Europe, in the world writ large, where people were anguishing about what they felt very palpably was a lived globalization, right? Things were happening in real time that were kind of startling and maybe exciting, a little bit worrisome. It was a kind of feeling of novel living in history, that the world is being connected, the world is being thrust into conversations and conflicts in new, patently global ways. There is a historian whom I much admire. Her name is Holly Case, and she's written this kind of incredible intellectual history book about the age of questions. And she talks about this era of history, this era of kind of Esperanto's emergence as a time in which the world and European elites in particular were obsessing over all of these uppercase big questions, the woman question, the sex question, the Polish question, the Jewish question. And there was also the international language question. Zamenhof himself would talk about the international language question. Many of the people who entertained the idea of Esperanto, even if they weren't sold on it, right, were kind of brought into this growing debate over, does the world need an international language? If so, what type of language does it need? What should it do? What should it accomplish? And what's the best approach? So again, from a very kind of historicist impulse, my desire here was to bring out and to illuminate better how these kind of contexts both shaped Zamenhof, shaped his vision, and shaped the emerging movement. The second chapter also makes an argument that some people might not expect about Imperial Russia. I push back against the notion that this was a kind of staid and kind of grim place where, ordinary people couldn't live or think or dream creatively. And to the best of my ability, I tried to better understand the kind of ordinary people in Imperial Russia who embraced Zamenhof's vision, took it upon themselves to learn or at least experiment with the idea of Esperanto, and what and how Esperanto, what it offered them and how it changed their vision of the world and their place within it. And with this kind of look at these quote unquote ordinary Esperantists, I tried to illuminate, how students and elites and merchants and nobles and even kind of semi-literate workers were drawn to Esperanto because they also wanted to kind of engage the big debates of the world, and they wanted to reach out and communicate with people throughout the Tsarist Empire and beyond, and to imagine themselves beyond Russia's borders as kind of global citizens. I think that their internationalism and their global consciousness is something that has been underappreciated by historians in general, but also historians of Russia who've kind of overlooked this very energetic and kind of pioneering cosmopolitanism on part of these ordinary internationalists. And as someone who I think personally was in part drawn to this project because I've always had a soft spot in my heart for kind of pen pal exchanges and snail mail, I wanted to also really kind of historicize how, again, the Esperantists were products of their time. They kind of exemplify the novelties of the age, right? In large measure, right, Esperanto could become this extraordinary movement that it was because there were revolutions going on in terms of kind of postal services, postal exchanges, and for the price of a small amount of postage, you could reach out and send to your comrade or your pen pal in Moscow a postcard of a Native American tribe that was, indigenous to where you might be in Oregon in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be a kind of brief engagement of what I do in chapter 2. My personal favorite chapter of the whole book is the third chapter, which is actually one of the kind of saddest chapters from not the saddest, but one of the saddest chapters from the perspective of my Esperantist historical subjects. But the third chapter kind of takes off with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And the drama of chapter 3 revolves in many ways around this institution that I referenced earlier, the Comintern, which was the Communist International, which the Bolsheviks established in Moscow in 1919. The Comintern was supposed to be the Bolsheviks' new international. The idea was that in Moscow, at least at first, the Comintern would be the headquarters of world revolution. Because of course, the Bolsheviks don't want just the socialist revolution in Russia, right? They want, and they also desperately need, socialist revolution all throughout Europe, and ultimately they want to refashion the whole world. I don't think it's lost on anyone in the audience that what is notable about the banner that decorated the dais here at the first meeting of Communist International, and it probably will also not surprise you when I tell you that the first official working languages of the Communist International were German, and Russian was also allowed. German was the international language of the left in the late 19th and early 20th century, and many of the intellectuals who were in attendance for this founding Congress were kind of inured to the idea that you choose a kind of national language, and that's the running international language of these leftist debates. Esperantists in revolutionary Russia read in the news about the founding of the Communist International, and very reasonably, they think this is our chance, right? I mean, if ever there was a kind of ready-made opportunity to marry kind of Esperantist visions with the kind of Bolshevik program, right? It seemed that this was it, right? If you have a meeting of international revolutionaries from all over the world, it would just make sense to use an international language. And here is Esperanto. Now, why is this chapter, as I said, kind of very sad from the perspective of the Esperantists? The Bolsheviks weren't having it, right? They were amazingly kind of uninterested in the question of Esperanto. They saw it as a distraction, as at best what one historian referred to in terms of Bolshevik cultural conservatism in these years as a utopian luxury that they could not afford. And the results of the Comintern were also pretty predictable, right? It was linguistic cacophony, right? Unless you were an international leftist participating in the Comintern who was fluent in multiple European languages, you are oftentimes sitting through hours upon hours of these meetings and debates about how to kind of fashion a world revolution, right? Which of course you're feeling very strongly about and having no idea what was being said, right? And the kind of linguistic injustice was on display year after year in the early kind of meetings of the Comintern. Again, the story is sad if you look at it from this perspective of the Esperantists, perhaps, because ultimately the Bolsheviks, they do not kind of listen to any calls to bring Esperanto to the task of making the affairs of the Communist International possible. Instead, what they ultimately do is they start to move more energetically to making Russian the international language of socialism in the 20th century. And in the meantime, they adopted as early as 1927 new novel kind of technologies to begin experimenting with simultaneous interpretation at the Comintern World Congresses. And before the Comintern was ultimately shut down, they remained committed to kind of a slate of what they called working languages for the Comintern's affairs. And by the mid-1930s, that did include Chinese and it did include Arabic. But in the 1920s, the Comintern overwhelmingly privileged the languages that the Bolshevik leaders themselves, many of them, were fluent in, which were European languages of German and French, English, and Russian. The next chapter moves beyond the Comintern and into kind of new territory that the Soviet Esperantists pursued in the 1920s, especially. That decade was one in which the Soviet state kind of swung its doors kind of wide open to foreigners to come in and to witness the building of socialism. And it was the kind of apogee of interwar Soviet cultural diplomacy. So the Soviet Union would invite delegations of artists and workers and intellectuals, business people who were, ideologically opposed to the regime, people who were ideologically aligned with the regime. And in this context, the Soviet Esperantists, again, really, really kind of motivated, said, hey, we have something really special and awesome to offer and to bring to the table, right? Esperanto would allow ordinary Soviet people and the foreigners who are coming to visit us and also hopefully coming to help us build socialism. It allows them to converse, right? And in an unmediated fashion, without the need of translators, without the need of interpreters, right? We can offer something really special and really valuable to the goals, the established goals of Soviet interwar cultural diplomacy. So this was offered in terms of just kind of guided, offering up kind of Esperanto in the service of guided tours. Those of you who are here this evening, I'm sure know about this kind of big moment in 1926 when Leningrad hosted the World Congress of Proletarian Esperantists. But the Soviet Esperantists were also really busying themselves saying, like, we can unleash the power of radio to converse with comrades abroad. And of course, we can use pen pal correspondence, collective correspondence, networks of Esperanto that allow us to transcend language barriers, borders, interpreters, translators. Ultimately, this sales pitch, if you'll allow me the phrase, as confident as the Soviet Esperantists were in it, was what soured a lot of Soviet officials on the idea of Esperanto itself, right? Which, if we're being honest, they weren't terribly excited about. The kind of institutions of Soviet interwar cultural diplomacy were extremely reliant and increasingly reliant on making use of language barriers, on the Soviet state hiring guides who were fluent in German or French or English or whatever, right? Who were trained in the art of creatively translating things in case a visitor or ordinary Soviet citizen, right, said something that was not politically allowable or particularly complementary to the regime or to the kind of very startling for many visitors realities of early Soviet life. So this kind of pitch too fizzles out already, already by the late 1920s. It doesn't, mean that the Soviet Esperantists, stopped making these bids, but they kind of switched tactics moving into Stalin's Industrial Revolution and the first and second 5-year plans. And they moved to making an argument that, again, kind of is really adaptive to the times, right? Now we're moving into Stalin's Industrial Revolution, and there's this big push to industrialize at breakneck speed. And the Soviet Union needs not just kind of foreign hard currency, but also foreign expertise. And so kind of feeling the kind of rebuff, right, at the Comintern first, but then in this kind of cultural diplomacy mode, the Soviet Esperantists kind of switch tactics and say, hey, Esperanto, again, will be really useful for Soviet needs because we can readily and easily translate for Soviet engineers and Soviet scientists and chemists, right, blueprints and models and textbooks and all the rest. And there was even this shift, right, in the quote unquote collective correspondence that the Soviet Esperantist Union engaged in, where they started sending these kind of collective letters out to workers in Germany and the United States saying, hey, can you, tell us how you do things at your kind of metallurgical institute or at your factory, and asking for types of things that they could then turn around and say, right, to Soviet authorities, look, again, this is what we promised you. There's a real needed place for Esperanto in Bolshevik Revolution and this Soviet experiment. It also does not go terribly well, ultimately, for the Soviet Esperantists. They were drowned out during this particular campaign, during Stalin's first and second 5-year plans, by a new program that the state had launched called Foreign Languages to the Masses. One that was championed by, among other people, Lenin's sister, who had lots of unpleasant things to say about Esperanto, which she denigrated as a lifeless language that at best offered utility to people with nefarious goals and maybe suspect desires to kind of subvert the needs or the wants of the Soviet regime. So while all of these kind of various pitches end up having kind of diminishing returns in terms of the Soviet state kind of increasingly being even more lackluster in its support of the Soviet Esperantist movement, it leaves the Soviet Esperantists with kind of few new angles to pursue. And when they're left with maybe the fewest of potential new angles to pursue in terms of arguing about usefulness and patriotic service that could be offered to the Soviet Union, when they come under increasing suspicion for engaging in bourgeois, egotistical, narrow-minded, individualistic, and potentially kind of treasonous individual pen pal correspondence, this coincides with these really dangerous years in Soviet history. First, the year 1936, where things really start to go downhill for anyone who has not just kind of foreign language fluency, but documented and extensive ties with foreign organizations or foreign individuals abroad, right? Things get so bad in terms of Stalinist xenophobia in the mid-1930s, even before the kind of purges and terror are in full swing, where, there are reports of NKVD officers who are instructed to go look through the old phone books and find people with simply foreign-sounding names. And people remember during these years, it was seen as dangerous to even receive a postcard from somebody abroad, right? Not to mention the specificity here of Esperantist correspondence, but for anyone. And so in this context, it was bad news for the Esperantists, as it was bad news for a lot of people in the Soviet Union during these particularly bleak and grim years of the purges and the terror. But again, those kind of marks of suspicion, those marks of presumed treason that already marked people as early as 1936. I mean, they were really, for many, death sentences, or at least gulag sentences, already in 1937 and 1938. These being years of terror and the years in which the Soviet Esperantists, in large numbers, were decimated. The Comintern, as a larger organization, again, just to kind of think about all of this holistically, was also a Soviet organization that was utterly decimated during these years, right? And very kind of similar complaints or accusations that were lobbied against the Esperantists were the types of things that were ultimately lobbied against the fluent English speakers, German speakers, French speakers, Chinese speakers who worked for the Comintern as people who translated and exchanged messages and couriered things and traveled across borders in the service of international revolution. So on this note, I do end the book, of course, with what Brandon referenced in his review of my book as the kind of story that many of you know, right? The tragic demise of the Union of Soviet Esperantists during Stalin's purges and terror. And I think that story is worth knowing more broadly in and of its own right. But I also think, right, for my own very, narrow purposes as a historian invested in a specific historiography and a field of Soviet history, I also think this tells us something really important that maybe we haven't spent enough time talking about, which is this ambiguous premium that the Soviet state placed on foreign language ability and the kind of discomfort that the Soviet state, before Stalin, especially during Stalin, but even after Stalin, felt about foreign languages and what they could or couldn't do for the Soviet state and its domestic and foreign policy goals. And it's a complicated story. It's paradoxical in some ways. One of the things that I do emphasize, however, is that, as is so often the case in history, it's not necessarily a straight story. The same Soviet state that in the years of the purges and the terror went after and hounded and executed and arrested Esperantists and Comintern typists and interpreters and translators and ordinary people who did nothing, right, was also the same state that in the same years was kind of opening its doors to the orphans of the Spanish Civil War and kind of remaining, at least theoretically, committed to earlier principles of internationalism. These ambiguities and these contradictions are part of the story, right? They're not easily solved away. I think that I have used up my 30 minutes, but I for my own self, if for no one else's, I did want to call your attention, if you look at the photo here of the group of Esperantists who attended the 1926 Lenin Congress. The woman in the center, Ida Lisichnik, is someone who was really fascinating to me throughout, and I wish that I had kind of more access to her in the archives than I did. But even what I had was really fascinating to me. She survived the purges, and she was interviewed later in life in the Khrushchev era and even in the Brezhnev era about her life. And she said in one of the interviews that she still credited Esperanto, and she would always credit Esperanto as giving her the brightest and best years of her life and animating and giving purpose to her youth before the revolution, after the revolution, and even in the darkest days of the Stalinist 1930s.
So yes, we're going to do the show of hands for questions so that we can have some order to this. I guess Ralph is first.
Yeah, it's fantastic talk, and it's a subject that interests me quite a bit, as you can see from my comments. I do have a question, which I don't know how much you found out about Zamenhof himself. I know quite a bit about Zamenhof's engagement with Zionism and the Jewish question and all that other business, but one thing that I never found out was what his view on other political questions. I do agree with other people that he was rather naive and rather provincial and backwards in terms of his political sophistication. But I noticed in Brandon's review that Zamenhof was happy about the February Revolution in 1917. And I'm wondering if you found anything else about, because one thing that always intrigued me about Zamenhof is that he lets on in a paper he wrote for the 1911 Universal Races Congress, which is full of his really naive ideas. He has one little paragraph that suggests that he's aware of something that he never pursues. And it's just a couple sentences. What he says is, and I'll quote, it's all on my website too, by the way, in both languages, English and Esperanto. Can we say, for instance, that so many millions of poor Russians hate the millions of poor Chinese on economic grounds when they shed their blood so willingly to defend the Russian oppressors against the attacks of foreigners? Assuredly not, for the Russian soldier knows very well when he kills a Chinese soldier that the man would never do him as much harm as the mailed fist of his own compatriots. It is not economic causes that give rise to national hatreds. Now, there's almost a glimmer of awareness that he understands something, and then it disappears. Then it just disappears back into his ideas about what causes the problems between peoples. Now, I'm wondering if you found anything else about Zamenhof, aside from the February Revolution or his general views about things that I haven't really got around to exploring if the documentation exists.
Ralph, I wish I had something more definitive to offer you beyond perhaps the consolation that I was left vis-a-vis Zamenhof with a kind of similar set of questions. Because I also read that speech he gave at that 1911 Congress, and that was one of the most remarkable ones to me, for a part that you didn't quite quote, right, where it's this kind of like extreme emphasis, right, that the real problem, it always comes down to language, right? I mean, he never let go of that, even when he was invited to come talk to a Congress especially designed to talk about race and racial problems and acrimony and bitterness. And, I can only deal with what is said or what is in the papers, but the question that drove me, which I think is a similar one, or, preoccupied me, was to what extent was this a strategy, right? Like a thoughtful, willed, conscious political strategy on his part? Or was it, as you potentially suspect, right, just a kind of a stubborn position of political naivete, right? And I don't know, right? But I think that it is interesting to contemplate the possibility that it might have been a conscious strategy on his part to just never kind of stray from that, what was for him the fundamental line, right? And the kind of bargaining chip as well, which is that if you solve the language problem, if you solve the language question, then you can solve all else. It's also possible, of course, right, that it's it's both, right? That there's a combination here of kind of a willed strategy and perhaps a political naivete. But I think that speech was also, for me, one of the more interesting kind of moments. I was struck by how insistent he was on holding the line, that it always and in all cases comes down to language. I should apologize. I have no idea what's going on in the chat. So hopefully someone can save it for me and share it with me at a later point. But Haas, maybe if something's happened in the chat that you want to follow up.
Well, let's see. Hans mentioned that he had the same questions. I'm not sure if he wanted to follow up or if he just wanted to.
Well, I just am curious if you found any sort of documentary evidence that would imply that Zamenhof was sympathetic to the February Revolution, because I don't recall anything in the complete works of Zamenhof. I just took the volume off my shelf to check again for those dates, and I couldn't find anything. But of course, there is other documentation, especially that not written in Esperanto, that isn't in the complete works. So
I don't expect that there's anything that you haven't read that's out there. Right? He also didn't live very long, right? There was a very little space of time between the February Revolution and when the poor man expires in declining health. So
yeah, there are like 4 letters that I could find in there, and so you didn't find anything.
No, and he was
Okay.
also, what I recall of writing in that moment where I kind of start to conclude the first chapter is, I was kind of emphasizing that once again he found himself, even at this moment of kind of being on the eve of his death, as this kind of in this liminal place in terms of thinking about the Tsarist Empire, right? Because Poland had been overrun and all this, right? He has no idea what's going to happen, but also, right, but I didn't come across any kind of novel document or unearth anything special. It's, I also don't expect that there's something lurking out there because there was really such a short amount of time there.
Yeah, no, that just, when I read Brandon's review, that really surprised me. I mean, he says, O'Keeffe's is the first mention I have seen of Zamenhof's positive reaction to the revolution.
Okay.
And I had just, like Ralph, I had heard nothing of any reaction that he had, positive or negative, although I'm certain that even someone as politically naive as Zamenhof probably had some reaction to the revolution, since he was, reading his newspaper and smoking 6 packs a day and, doing all of the things that he liked to do and corresponding, especially with Marie Henkel. I don't know if that name rings a bell for you, but she seems to be in the last year of his life, one of his most frequent correspondees. So, yeah.
Murray, I saw Murray's hand go up.
You mentioned that woman in the last picture. She gave a lot of credit to Esperanto for her life in total, I guess. Well, why would she say that?
Why would she say that? I think that she would say that because it really did give her the best years of her life. She's somewhat, I think the reason why it sticks out to me, Murray, is because in the late 1930s, she watched her friends and her comrades go down one by one, right? She herself was, denounced and somehow got out by the skin of her teeth, right? Of course, some of them did, right? She survived the terror and the purges, but, comrades that she had been working with in the weeds in the 1920s and the 1930s. I mean, these Esperantists, they were putting so much energy and so much enthusiasm trying to make all of these cases to like a really reluctant regime that was kind of like, stop bothering us with your little pastime, right? We've got big affairs. Like that was the Bolshevik response to the Esperantists on a good day, right? On a bad day, it was, what kind of sabotage are you engaged in while you're writing to your pen pal in Paris? I think that it is a testament to the power that Esperanto had and exerted over these people who really found purpose and meaning and connection, not just in the Soviet Union, not just in late imperial Russia, but throughout the world, that even after the whole thing came crashing down, and she very easily could have lost her life for nothing, she still looked back and she said, those years when I was in my university days, when I was in my 20s and when I was in my 30s, when I was organizing pen pal campaigns with workers in Germany, that was the most meaningful days of my life, right? I think it's a remarkable testament to just how much existential meaning these people found in the real opportunities Esperanto gave them to make out new networks, new lives, new visions, new horizons. that survived despite the heavy-handedness of Tsarist authoritarianism or Stalinist authoritarianism. For me, that's one of the reasons why she's such a kind of bright light for me, and that I really wanted to emphasize her story at the end of the book. I also wanted to shine a light on her additionally, because even if you look again at the photo that I showed you, right, she was like the only woman who operated on a kind of leadership level within the Union of Soviet Esperantists, which also like takes a great deal of kind of courage and nerve, right, to be the kind of woman among men. So as a human being and as a woman and a feminist, I also was like attracted to her story in that sense too, and really drawn to that image. But Marie, I think that she's, like so many Esperantists are, right, a testament to the power of this language to kind of open up new worlds for people, meaningful worlds that, historians, I think, should pay more attention to.
Well, you say that she escaped from Russia.
Oh, sorry, she didn't escape from Russia. She escaped arrest and execution. She lived out her life in the Soviet Union, but while she was denounced, she did not get arrested or serve a term in the Gulag. She somehow, escaped that terrible fate.
I think Brandon was next.
Hey, Brigid, it's Brendan. Good to actually meet you. I have so many questions, and I'm aware that, we're coming up on our 45 minutes. Try to just ask one question at a time and let other people ask questions as well. So one thing I was wondering about is if you came across any discussion among Jewish activists, either Zionists or like Jewish labor socialists in the Russian Empire, of Esperanto as a Jewish project, or any identification with Zamenhof. Like, were people who were planning to emigrate to Israel or Palestine, I guess, talking about Esperanto, or because this was about the time that the Jewish Labor Bund was forming in parts of Russia and Poland and Lithuania, were they talking about Esperanto, and did they recognize it as reflecting anything particularly Jewish or cosmopolitan or anything like that? I
haven't found anything substantive beyond one of my favorite sources. Brandon, you probably picked up on this. One of my favorite sources were the classified ads where the Esperantists would say like what they wanted to talk about with their potential pen pals. And I did see in the late imperial years, there were people who wanted to talk about the Jewish question and socialism and Esperanto, but they're kind of, these little glimmers on my horizon. My instinct is that they were out there, but I didn't come across them, and someone might come across them still. But I didn't see, when I went into the archives, I wasn't kind of looking expressly for, kind of Bundist sources or that type of thing, but maybe it's there. I wouldn't be surprised, I'll say that.
Okay, I think Jonathan Santoro was next.
Hello. So I have a question about your methodology in making this book. You said at the very beginning that you understand Esperanto a bit, but you aren't conversant in it. Am I correct on that?
Yes.
So I'm also interested in studying Esperanto history, but I'm not great with the language myself. So I'm curious to know how you went about dealing with primary sources.
Well, many of my primary sources were in Russian. So this shouldn't necessarily surprise any of us, right? When Zamenhof writes to the Tsarist authorities, right, when he first tries to get permission to publish his journal, he's not going to write to them in Esperanto, right? Of course, he's going to write to them in Russian, right? I also think too, right, for me, like, and I think of like the imagery and the iconography of this project. I oftentimes when I, try and talk about my work, especially with an audience who are not people who are kind of conversant in Esperanto or Esperanto history, one of the first images I usually begin with is the front, the title page of the original Esperanto primer from 1887, right? Where of course it is in Russian. So it's not just the imperial period where many of my sources were in Russian or in the kind of early periodicals that the Russian Esperantists were producing. Oftentimes, it was in both languages, Esperanto and Russian, but also in the Soviet period, right? The Esperantists all the time when they had to go to the state and make their claims and make their bid and make their pleas, right, and defend themselves, they couldn't write to the Comintern or to Stalin in Esperanto. So most of those documents are, of course, in Russian, but also their Soviet journal was in Russian. And then in terms of the kind of Esperanto that I taught myself in haphazard fashion to read, got me through some of the Esperanto texts that I otherwise relied upon. But the kind of simple answer is the sources that I relied upon, or the bulk of the sources that I used, ended up being available to me in Russian. And then, sometimes I was able to use things or primary sources that were available to me in other languages as well. I don't know where to look sometimes when there's a whole table, but I hope that answered at least in part the question.
It did. That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Tim Rice was next.
This is one of those questions that I have been thinking ever since raising my hand of, oh boy, how to even phrase this. What made me think of it was about reading Zamenhof's works and coming to a point where he was talking about racism, and his take on it made me think, oh friend, you've never been to the US. I'm glad you haven't seen just how obsessed some people can be with sacrificing so much so that others can't have that either. And I was wondering, did you find anything in your work about, because Russia didn't have and still doesn't have the same intentionally stabbing itself in the foot constantly about different ethnic groups, but did you find anything in your research about that really, really fraught dynamic in especially the early Soviet Union?
Well, in terms of Zamenhof, right, I think he lived really painfully in a really self-aware way, right, that the structures of ethnic discrimination that's the pain position. The kind of interesting cross-fertilization, or the interesting way in which Zamenhof's attention was, at least for a brief time, drawn to the United States was, when he was a student and he was kind of flirting with proto-Zionist visions, right? There was a colony off in Louisiana that he read about in the Russian Jewish press. It was, some Russian Jews that had gone off to, in his, ecstatic mind, to the shores of the Mississippi to kind of build this potential colony from which future utopia could sprout. And so he had this moment where he actually thought, like, maybe the Russian Jews and Europe's Jews, right, promised land is on the shores of the Mississippi. But, he didn't live to see the Soviet Union. And that's, the Soviet kind of approach to ethnicity and race is a really complicated one, but one that I spend my time on in some of my other projects. The Soviets promised that they were expressly internationalist and anti-imperial, and they prided themselves on their anti-racism. And they did foster this kind of extraordinary, quote unquote, nationality politics, but they also, in their own way, generated a very kind of virulent homegrown racism. So it's a really complicated story, but Zamenhof did not live to see those days. But there was a brief moment in his history where he was attracted to the potentiality of a colony off on the shores of the Mississippi. I think Derek has been waiting.
Yes, Derek's next.
So I'd like to mention and ask if you're aware of something that I learned of for the first time just about a month ago, which is along the lines of a reference you made earlier of the International Technical Cooperation. And this is a group called Interhelpo, in Esperanto at least. It was put together predominantly by people from Czechoslovakia, but also from many other countries. And they moved 1,000 people, roughly, families and technicians, to Kyrgyzstan in 1924, 1925. And for the next almost 20 years, worked on industrial development in Kyrgyzstan. And this article claims that in 1930, it was really a complex of different industrial productive centers, produced 20% of all industrial output in the entire country of Kyrgyzstan. And so this is a group of Esperantists who are working together with the Soviet ideal of raising the production and the technical knowledge and the style of life in this rather backwater province. But they already were facing exactly what you described by believing in the Soviet principles, they were suspect. By spreading the international revolution, they were suspect. And in the last few years, they were suffering the same purges and executions that idealists and Esperantists everywhere else in the Soviet Union.
I don't know about this particular case. I will say, well, on one level, it's like surprising to me because I'm thinking, oh my God, that's a great story. Or like someone should write like a popular history essay about that and people will eat it up. But on another level, I'm not surprised by it at all, right? In the sense of, in the 1920s and even into the 1930s, there were all kinds of collectives of people from all around the world who looked to the Soviet Union with so much hope, right? That it's really going to happen, right? This is going to be the place, right? All we have to do is get there, bring our particular skills, bring our labor, bring our enthusiasm, bring our commitment, right? And we'll help build, the best society that the world has ever seen, right? And the Soviet Union was pretty receptive to all different types of, types of constituencies, types of groups who wanted to come to the Soviet Union. So there would be, kind of groups of American feminists, certainly a great number of American laborers or workers as individuals came over to the Soviet Union, in increasing numbers once the Great Depression hit. There were certainly Jewish colonists who came to the Soviet Union, and once they got the kind of that Bijan project off on the ground, there's like large numbers of American Jews who traveled to the Soviet Union. And sadly, Derek, right, almost to the last, right, all of these different little endeavors, these experiments that were kind of very committed contributions to the great big Soviet experiment, almost to the last, they end, in tragedy in the late 1930s. And this too is, right, one of the ways, right, you guys are probably sick of hearing me say it, but I think it's so important, right? The Esperantists are their own story, but they're part of a larger story in which this Stalinist xenophobia that gets unleashed in the late 1930s, it came down hard and fierce on just about anyone who had a foreign connection or who was foreign, no matter how patriotically. And so many of them were kind of patriotically giving their all to this idea and this vision, the Soviet Union, that they really did want to see come to life in accord with their revolutionary and expressly socialist dreams. But I would love to read more about that group. One thing that does surprise me is why, when the leaders of the Union of Soviet Esperantists kind of made that push during the first 5-year plans of like, will be the helpmates of Stalinist technocratic and industrial expertise, why they didn't try to hype that up more, but who knows. But that's I thank you for bringing that to my attention.
One little footnote on it in the language question is that they started out intending to speak only Esperanto in this complex of industrial production centers, but they couldn't do it. They needed both more technical language than they had in Esperanto, at least, but they also needed more cooperation with everyone around them than they initially suspected, and they didn't get everyone to learn Esperanto. So they ended up working in this Esperanto-based pidgin that no one else could speak except the people in their complex. But it had enough Russian and enough Kyrgyz and enough German and Czech that people could get what they needed done, but at the same time, they had isolated them from every language group in the world.
Well, maybe we've just cracked the answer to my question. Why didn't they, hype up this example? Because when the Union of Soviet Esperantists were saying, we'll give you blueprints, we'll give you manuals, we'll give you, we'll make engineering easy. The Soviet bureaucrats were like, you're going to have to make the vocabulary, then you're going to have to teach the engineers Esperanto. I hate to say it, but so many times it was so obvious, like reading the bureaucratic responses to these really ardent, enthusiastic, Esperantists. It was just like this one big eye roll. Like they had no faith that there was a there. And so it's pretty heartbreaking, but it was kind of the standard feature of the Soviet bureaucratic response, I have to say.
Okay, we've only got less than a minute left, and I know poor Brandon has been waiting very patiently, so I'm going to have to say, sorry, Brandon, you'll have to wait for email. I'd like to use the remaining minute we have to thank Dr. O'Keeffe so much for coming to speak to us. It's really a pleasure. And everybody, please unmute if you'd like to thank her. Or yes, you can do it the ASL way, too.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be able to talk about my work with you. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks. And also thanks to Brandon, I should mention, who came up with the idea of inviting Dr. O'Keeffe, which is, he deserves a lot of thanks for that, too. All right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much.